Hey everybody, welcome back. So this is my story, and I'm titling it My Story, My Saving. This is the story of my saving that took place on January 1st, 2004. But I'm going to do this in 4 parts, and this first part is just going to give you some background information. I think for you to be able to understand why this event was so profound in my life, I think you have to understand some of the background that came from my childhood and how I was raised and the influences that led up to January 1st, 2004. Now, I wasn't raised in a religious home. I wasn't raised in a Christian home. My parents didn't share with me their faith or their belief in God. Not formally anyway. They never sat me down and said, "Hey Nino, we believe in God, we believe this, that, or the other, and here's why." So when I look back, there are certainly indicators that both my parents have faith, and both of my parents are believers. But I didn't know that at the time. Now that I think back, I think about how my mom would tuck us in at night and we would say a prayer, or she would ask us to say a prayer. And I didn't really understand, what am I praying about? What is prayer all about? And I certainly didn't understand this idea of God and praying to God. So it felt like a chore to me, and I didn't really much look forward to it. It just felt like something I had to do. And I also remember my mom essentially dragging us to midnight mass at Christmas time. And I knew we were going to church, but I had no idea. I mean, no idea. I had no idea that we were celebrating the birth of Jesus Christ. I had no idea that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. So I didn't really understand what we were doing. As far as my father, there were some indicators there as well. I remember my father being angry at God. My father had some very traumatic things happen to him in his life, and one of the most significant had to have been my sister's passing. So my sister Peggy Sue, who I never met because she passed before I was born, was my father's first child. And by the time she was 13, she became ill and she had passed away. And so that tragedy, with other tragedies in my father's life, all I knew was he was angry at God. And being so small, being a child, I had no idea that meant he believed in God. I just knew he was angry with God. I didn't put the two together. To be angry at God must have meant he believed in God. And so, like I said, there was indications, but I didn't know God. I wasn't taught about God. I wasn't sat down and helped to understand like what my parents' faith was and what they believed and how that impacted their lives. And so as I grew up, I started to obviously meet some friends, and those friends' parents would be what I would call, fairly regular churchgoers, right? And so I had a couple of friends whose mothers attended church on a pretty regular basis. And I found myself getting, suckered into going a couple of times, because as things happen, you start spending nights over at friends' houses and whatnot, and come Sunday morning when their parents are going to church and kind of expect their child to go with them, if you wanted to spend the night Saturday night, you kind of anticipated, I gotta go to church with them on Sunday. And it still didn't make sense to me. I still didn't know what it was about. And then it got even more weird, because as I'd go to church services and I would see things, like if I was at a Catholic Mass, I'd see this person up in the front of the church, and he or she would be talking, and we would be standing and then sitting and then standing and then sitting, and they would talk, and then when they were done saying something, everybody around me seemed to say the exact same thing back to them. Not the same thing that they said to the congregation, but the congregation was saying back to the priest or the minister something, all in unison. And I would just feel lost. I would feel as though obviously I didn't know something, because I wasn't taught whatever they were taught, and I had no idea what they were even saying, let alone could I predict to say it with them when they said it. So I would go to church services and I would just see weird things that didn't make sense to me. Some of the other things I would see is maybe they were calling people up to be saved, and at that time I had no idea what that meant. But people would be up in the front of the church, and the pastor or the priest or the minister would lay hands on their forehead and people would fall over. And it was just weird to me. I had no idea what was going on. And so it was very, very foreign, and it just didn't make any sense to me. And so as I approached like my teen years, I started hearing things that made more sense to me. And one of the things that I heard, and one of the things that I really kind of bought into was, well, the Bible is written by man, and anything man-made is bad for you. Well, that made sense to me. It made a lot more sense to me than what I was seeing in churches. I would see people crying and falling over and all of these different things, and I had no idea why. So when I heard, well, the Bible was written by man, okay, that makes sense. In fact, it was. I didn't know at the time that it was authored by the different, the number of different authors that it's authored by, and I didn't know it was a collection of 66 books, and I didn't know that it was written over a time span of 1,500 years. I didn't know any of that. And so here I thought, okay, we have a book. It was written by man. And then I started contemplating the whole, well, anything man-made is bad for you. Well, that made sense to me too, because, if you think about it, there are things on this earth now that didn't exist before. Something like as simple as plastic, right? So man made plastic, and years later we find out it's non-biodegradable and it's harming the earth and all of these different things. Or take something a little less dramatic but still has just as bad an impact as some of the artificial sweeteners that we find in soda and all these other things. At first we think, oh, well, we made this thing great, that we can eliminate calories and these other things, but we can still sweeten a soft drink, and come to find out that that might cause cancers or other health issues. It made sense that anything man-made was bad for you. Now, I don't remember exactly where I heard that. Maybe I heard it from friends, maybe I heard it from my father. I don't really remember where I got it, but I know that I bought into it, and I know that I kind of latched onto it. And so it made more sense, right? And for somebody who was trying to kind of piece it all together, and not even really piece it together, because I wasn't giving it that much thought, but when I would think about it or somebody would ask me, it just made sense. The Bible's man-made, and anything man-made for you is bad. And that was about the extent of my argument. Which brings me to my next point. As a teenager, if you had to label me, I guess you would label me agnostic. I didn't know enough to be atheist. I didn't know God or the topic of God well enough for somebody to say, well, you're an atheist, because I never told people I didn't believe in God, and I never went around telling other people, hey, I've done all of this reading and all this research, and now I've come to the conclusion that there is no God. That never happened. But at the same time, I wasn't a believer, so I guess if you had to label me, you'd probably label me agnostic. And again, it's just because I didn't know any better, and anytime the topic of God came up, I had my go-to response: the Bible is man-made, and anything man-made is bad for you. And that kind of takes us into my 20s. So here you have my background up to my 20s. Didn't grow up in a religious household or a very Christian household, although there were indicators that my parents were believers. They just never really shared it with me to any extent that I understood. And then as I grew up and met friends who may have been believers themselves and saw their parents who were churchgoers, it just didn't really make sense to me. And then I was offered one soundbite, if you will, and all of a sudden I had my answer. Oh, that makes sense. The Bible is man-made, and anything man-made is bad for you. Still didn't really answer the question about God. And so we transitioned into my 20s, And early in my 20s, by the time I was 21, I lost my dad to lung cancer. And again, my dad never really shared anything other than his anger at God. And I still hadn't given it any thought that it meant that because you were angry at God, at least you believed in God. And so I didn't really know anything about my father's faith. And so my dad passes and we have a service for him. Well, my father was a Mason. I had no idea what that meant at the time. I do remember he was trying to recruit me to become a Mason at the age of 18. I don't remember all of the technical terms for what an 18-year-old is who is trying to become a Mason. But come to find out after my saving that a Mason is somebody who has a belief in God, and they could have a variety of different beliefs amongst the men who are Masons, but it meant that they believed. Well, I digress, and so we have this service at the Masonic Lodge. And I remember that the mother of a girl I had dated comes up to me afterwards and she's like, Nino, I'm not really familiar with what we just experienced. Could you explain it to me? No. I had no idea. She probably had a better idea just because she was a woman of faith and kind of understood everybody's, or different faiths, if you will. And so she probably had a better understanding of what we had just experienced than I did. And it was my father's service. So that left me with an emptiness, if you will. So we had this service for my father. And if I think back on it, I don't know that at the time of his passing, I had any interaction with God about it. Meaning, I don't know that I questioned God and why he took my father. I don't know that I felt like there wasn't a God because my father had passed. I don't think I even wrestled with any indication, yay or nay, about God at the time of my father's passing. And so after my father's death, I went through a couple of transitions in my life. And I did all of those transitions as agnostic. I still didn't know anything about God. And I actually remember a couple of times like thanking God for some ungodly things, right? I was in my early 20s. I was doing some things that I probably shouldn't have been doing or whatever the case may be. And I actually remember a couple of times like, thank you, Lord. And so, again, it's not that I didn't believe, but I didn't really understand or comprehend, so therefore I couldn't truly believe. And so, go through a number of transitions, and one of those transitions brings me down to Phoenix, Arizona, where two of my closest friends are living. And so I come down in 2002, and in 2003, I had no idea how God was going to use that year to prepare my heart. God prepared my heart in 2003 throughout pretty much the entire year leading up to my saving. And of course at the time I had no idea. I wasn't aware of what was going on around me. Now that I look back on it, it's evident that it was preparation for what was about to happen. And so midway through the year, I had transitioned jobs, and in the new job, I had met a man who had just actually been saved himself. And I still, at that time, didn't really understand what being saved meant, but I knew he had a newfound faith. And he was sharing that, and more than his newfound faith and sharing it, I realized quickly that Todd, my coworker, was a gentle-hearted person. Whatever happened in his life recently that led him on this path had just made him a very gentle person, a very caring person. And this was the opposite of who I was in 2003. In 2003, I was a very selfish individual. Not to say that I'm not still somewhat selfish and still struggle with that every single day, but in 2003, I was a selfish individual. I cared for other people, but I cared for myself more. And I remember during that year too, my sister had done an amazing thing for me. I needed a car, and she had a friend selling a car, and so she got the car and she put some repairs into the car and gave me the car. Just handed it to me. No questions asked, right? She knew I was in need, and she helped to meet that need. And so people were just acting in a certain way in my life that was really preparing my heart for what was about to come. And so I go through these transitions, and my sister gives me the car, and I'm at this new job, and I see this guy, and I was dating a woman who at the time I felt had a very strong faith as well. So God was definitely around. Now, I believe God now to be around all the time, but I'm saying he was there. He was there circulating, stirring some things up, and he was really preparing me for what was about to come. And I remember in 2003, there was also a movie I was really, really excited to see. It actually stars Jim Carrey, and it's set in Buffalo, New York. And the topic of the movie, the plot, has everything to do with who God is. Now, if you're not sure what movie I'm referring to, it's Bruce Almighty. So Bruce Almighty came out in 2003, and the whole premise, as you know, is about who God is, right? Played by Morgan Freeman. This movie's about God not showing up in a man's life, but then shows up in a man's life, and even as I speak it I'm in awe of God's power. So I was really excited about this movie because ever since Liar Liar, I had been a really big Jim Carrey fan again. And, I probably was excited about the movie for all the wrong reasons. He was going to get God's powers. And so I remember in the trailer, he blows up this woman's skirt. He's making Steve Carell do embarrassing things, kind of as revenge. So, kind of like that childhood dream of I'm going to get back at every bully or whatever, with these powers. I was really excited about the movie, and like I said, for all the wrong reasons. So I go and I see the movie, and I don't really think anything of it. I think a lot of it now, but I didn't think much of it then. I did like it enough that I believe I saw it more than once in the theaters, and I went and saw it with one of my best friends. Like I said, just kind of enjoyed the movie. Had no idea at the time how that movie was going to prepare me for my saving. After I see this movie, the rest of 2003 got pretty weird. I had a falling out with one of my closest friends, and whenever things get weird for me at that time in my life, I was a flight risk. And so the girl I was dating and I had a trip planned to New York in late December, and I remember that it was like a 50-50 chance that I was coming back. I was most likely going to stay in New York and live with my mother and my stepfather. And so people would ask me, in preparation for that, they would ask me a couple of things. One, I had a couple of people asking me, well, what are you going to do about your car? Because they knew I was going to fly. And I had decided that I was going to give Todd, the guy at work who was recently saved and of a kind heart, I was going to give him the car. I was going to keep it in my name, but I was going to give him the keys because I knew he had trouble getting to and from work. He was taking public transportation or whatever the case may be. And so I decided I was going to give it to him, even though I had an offer for $1,200 from somebody to buy the car. So I feel like God was preparing my heart with that particular instance. And then I also remember people would ask me about the girl I was dating. Well, what are you going to do about this relationship you're in? And I remember, and it's so funny to me now, because without any real belief in God at the time, I would tell everybody, I'm leaving it in God's hands. I'm putting it in God's hands. I'm going to allow God to, I might not have said I'm going to allow God to handle that, but I always mentioned that I was going to put it in his hands. I'm going to put it in God's hands. I'm going to put it in God's hands. If we're meant to be together, we'll be together. I'm putting it in God's hands. And they were empty words. They were completely empty. I didn't have a relationship with God. I didn't believe in God at the time. They were empty words. It was something that sounded good, right? Something that you should say to maybe suggest that you have faith or that you think everything's going to work out. Now, the trip was scheduled for her and I to go to Buffalo. She was going to come back and spend Christmas with her family, and I was going to go spend Christmas with my mother on the other side of the state. And so I had a ticket to come back to Arizona. I just never used it. We took the trip, we spent our time in Buffalo, we parted ways, and I think we both knew I wasn't getting on that plane in a week. That would have been just before Christmas, so maybe like the 22nd, 23rd, or 24th of December. And God saved my life January 1st.